Picture this. You're standing in line at a busy military base cafeteria, tired after a long day of training. Behind you, a young woman in uniform waits patiently, her posture straight but relaxed. She looks fresh-faced, maybe new to the service. To most people glancing over, she appears to be just another junior enlisted member grabbing a quick meal. Then a gruff sergeant spots her. His eyes narrow as he notices something that irritates him. Maybe her uniform isn't perfectly pressed. Or perhaps he just feels like asserting his authority over someone he assumes is beneath him. Without hesitation, he marches over with that familiar swagger that comes with years of barking orders at recruits. "And what's your rank?" he mocks, his voice dripping with condescension, loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. He expects to see fear, stammering, maybe even tears. What he doesn't expect is the calm smile that spreads across her face, or the way conversations around them suddenly stop. "Dear Joe, please don't remove." Because sometimes the person you assume knows less than you actually knows everything. Sometimes the quiet professional standing beside you has walked through hell and earned every star, every ribbon, every mark of distinction through blood, sweat, and sacrifice you can't even imagine. And sometimes, your assumptions about who deserves respect are about to be shattered in the most humbling way possible. This is the story of one such moment, when prejudice met reality, when assumptions crashed into truth, and when a sergeant learned that respect isn't about who can shout the loudest, but about who has earned their place through courage, dedication, and an unbreakable commitment to serving something greater than themselves. What happens next will remind you why we should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover is wearing the uniform of someone who has sacrificed more for their country than most of us ever will. This is the book. It's about history. Captain Sarah Martinez had been through 3 combat deployments, led hundreds of soldiers through some of the most dangerous missions in Afghanistan, and earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire. But on this particular Tuesday evening at Fort Bragg, she was just trying to grab a sandwich before her night shift began. The base cafeteria buzzed with its usual dinner rush energy. Soldiers from various units sat clustered around tables, their conversations mixing into a familiar hum of military life. Sarah stood patiently in line, still wearing her ACUs from the day's training exercise. The fabric was a bit dusty. Her boots showed signs of the field work they'd been doing, but her uniform was regulation and properly worn. She had deliberately chosen not to wear her dress uniform with all its decorations today. After years of service, Sarah had learned that sometimes it was easier to blend in, especially when she was trying to decompress after a long day of coordinating training exercises for her unit.
Do you want to change the context of returning to the eye wall?
The weight of leadership was something she carried proudly, but everyone needed moments to just be another soldier in line for dinner.
Behind the serving counter, Private Johnson recognized her immediately.
Based on that, he'd seen Captain Martinez around the base plenty of times, had even heard stories about her legendary leadership during the 2019 deployment that saved her entire platoon from an ambush. But he kept his acknowledgments subtle, just a respectful nod as she approached. Some officers appreciated being treated like everyone else during off-duty moments. That's when Staff Sergeant Coleman entered the scene. Coleman had been in the Army for 12 years, and in his mind, those 12 years gave him the authority to correct any soldier who didn't meet his standards of military bearing. He was the type of NCO who believed that discipline came through intimidation, that respect was earned through fear, and that anyone who looked younger or smaller than him was probably doing something wrong. As he walked through the cafeteria, his eyes swept the room with the practiced gaze of someone always looking for problems to solve. His attention landed on Sarah's back as she waited in line. He noticed the slight wrinkles in her uniform from the day's field exercise, the way her hair was pulled back in a simple regulation bun rather than styled perfectly. And most importantly, he noticed that she appeared young and relatively small in stature. Coleman's assumption process was swift and absolute. Young-looking female soldier with a slightly dusty uniform? Obviously someone junior who had been slacking off during training. Probably a private or specialist who thought she could get away with substandard appearance just because the day was nearly over. This was exactly the kind of discipline issue that Coleman lived to address. Without taking the time to look more closely at her rank insignia, or consider that there might be more to the story, Coleman strode over with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to teach an important lesson about military standards. "Excuse me, soldier." Coleman's voice cut through the ambient noise of the cafeteria, loud enough that several nearby tables turned to look. His tone carried that particular edge that every military person recognizes. The voice of an NCO who spotted a problem and is about to make it everyone else's problem too. Sarah turned around slowly, her expression calm and patient. She had been in situations like this before, though not recently. The assumption game was something female officers dealt with regularly, especially those who were younger or didn't fit the traditional image of what some people expected military leadership to look like.
Yes, Sergeant, she replied, her voice steady and professional. Coleman felt validated by what he interpreted as appropriate deference.
Good, she was acknowledging his rank. Now to drive home the lesson. I'm looking at your uniform and I'm not impressed, he announced, his voice projecting across the immediate area. Just because we're a chow doesn't mean standards disappear.
You look like you've been rolling around in the dirt all day.
A few soldiers at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably.
Some recognized Sarah, others didn't, but most could sense that something was off about the interaction they were witnessing. Sarah's expression remained unchanged.
We've been conducting field training exercises all day, Sergeant. My uniform reflects honest work in service of readiness training. Her calm response only seemed to fuel Coleman's sense of authority. Here was a soldier, in his mind clearly a junior enlisted member, who seemed to think she could talk back and justify her appearance rather than simply accepting correction and promising to do better.
Field training, huh? Coleman's voice took on a mocking tone. Well, let me tell you something about field training, soldier.
I've been doing field training since before you probably even thought about joining the Army. And in all my years of service, I've managed to maintain proper military bearing regardless of the circumstances.
The cafeteria was getting quieter as more people tuned into the confrontation. This wasn't unusual. Military dining facilities regularly witnessed NCOs correcting soldiers, and it was generally considered part of the learning environment.
But something felt different about this interaction to the observers who knew both parties involved. Private Johnson behind the counter winced internally.
He could see exactly where this was heading, and he knew it wasn't going to end well for Sergeant Coleman.
But military protocol prevented him from intervening in what appeared to be a legitimate correction between an NCO and what Coleman obviously believed was a junior enlisted soldier. Furthermore, Coleman continued, warming up to his theme, attitude is everything in this man's army.
When a senior NCO takes the time to provide you with guidance, the appropriate response is, yes, Sergeant, and immediate corrective action, not excuses.
Sarah nodded slowly. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to handle situations like this was to let them play out naturally.
Force rarely changed minds as effectively as reality did. I understand your concern about standards, Sergeant, she said.
Standards and discipline are indeed crucial to military effectiveness. Coleman interpreted this as progress. Finally, the soldier was showing appropriate receptiveness to guidance.
Guidance is the medium to the country. That's more like it, he said, his chest puffing slightly with satisfaction. Now, what I want to know is what unit you're with, so I can make sure your NCOs know that their soldiers need additional training on uniform maintenance and military courtesy.
This question hung in the air for a moment. Sarah glanced around the cafeteria, noting how many people were now openly watching the interaction.
She saw a mix of expressions, some curious, some uncomfortable, and a few that clearly showed recognition and anticipation.
I'm with the 3rd Brigade Combat Team,
she answered truthfully.
Coleman nodded approvingly. He knew that unit well. It was a solid outfit with good leadership.
This made the soldier's substandard appearance even more disappointing. Good unit, he said, which means you have no excuse for this kind of performance. I know the NCOs in 3rd Brigade, and they maintain high standards. So either you're not listening to your team leaders, or they're not doing their jobs properly. The irony of the situation was becoming apparent to more and more observers. Several soldiers who recognized Captain Martinez were now watching with barely concealed amazement at the spectacle unfolding. A few were exchanging meaningful glances, wondering if they should intervene, but military protocol suggested they should let the situation resolve itself naturally. My leadership has always maintained the highest standards, Sarah replied. A slight emphasis on the word my that most people missed but a few caught. Coleman was too focused on his teaching moment to notice the subtle verbal cue. In his mind, he was successfully correcting a wayward soldier and reinforcing important military values in front of an audience. This was exactly the kind of leadership he prided himself on providing.
Well, they're obviously not getting through to you, he declared. So let me make this simple. After you finish eating, you will return to your barracks, properly clean and press your uniform, and tomorrow you will report to your first sergeant looking like the professional soldier the Army expects you to be.
Is that understood? The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter. Even servers had stopped what they were doing to observe the confrontation.
The tension wasn't hostile exactly, but there was definitely an electricity in the air that suggested something significant was about to happen. Sarah looked directly at Coleman, her expression still patient but with something new in her eyes, a glint that suggested the teaching moment was about to flow in an unexpected direction.
Sergeant Coleman? She said, her voice still calm but now carrying a subtle authority that made several nearby soldiers straighten unconsciously. Before we continue this conversation, I think there's something important you should know. Coleman frowned slightly.
How did she know his name? He glanced down at his name tape, then realized she could have easily read it during their conversation.
Still, something in her tone suggested a shift in the dynamic that he didn't quite understand. What I should know, he replied, is that when a senior NCO is providing guidance, soldiers listen rather than offering commentary.
But go ahead, enlighten me.
Sarah's slight smile was the kind that people who knew her well had learned to recognize. It was the expression she wore when she was about to turn a training exercise into a learning experience that no one involved would ever forget.
I think, she said clearly, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the ears of everyone who had been following the conversation, that you should take a closer look at my rank insignia before you continue this discussion. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Staff Sergeant Coleman's attention focused on the details he had been too confident to examine closely before.
The moment Staff Sergeant Coleman's eyes dropped to Sarah's uniform to actually examine her rank insignia, the entire dynamic of the cafeteria shifted like a weather front moving through.
His confident expression began to falter as his brain processed what he was seeing.
The silver bars on her collar weren't the chevrons he had expected. They weren't specialist ranks or sergeant stripes.
They were captain's bars, 2 silver parallel lines that represented years of education, training, leadership experience, and a level of responsibility that placed her not just above him in the chain of command, but significantly above him. The blood drained from Coleman's face as the full magnitude of his error became clear.
He had just spent the last several minutes lecturing a captain about military standards, uniform maintenance, and proper respect for authority.
He had threatened to contact her leadership as if she were a wayward private. He had spoken to her with the condescending tone reserved for correcting junior enlisted soldiers, and he had done all of this in front of a cafeteria full of witnesses.
Oh! The word escaped from Coleman's mouth like air from a punctured balloon.
He blinked several times, as if hoping that looking again might change what he was seeing. But the captain's bars remained exactly where they were, gleaming under the cafeteria's fluorescent lights like twin beacons of his colossal mistake.
Sarah watched his realization dawn with the same patient expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. She had been through enough leadership training and real-world experience to understand that this moment, this exact instant when understanding hit, was crucial.
How she handled Coleman's shock and embarrassment would determine whether this became a learning experience or a humiliating disaster that damaged morale and respect throughout the unit. "I believe you wanted to know my rank, Sergeant," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone within earshot exactly who was who in this conversation, but without the harsh edge that would have turned correction into cruelty.
Coleman's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. 12 years of military experience had taught him to handle many situations, but this particular scenario, discovering that you've been dressing down a superior officer for several minutes in public, wasn't covered in any NCO training manual he'd ever studied.
The cafeteria around them had gone nearly silent. Conversations that had been continuing despite the earlier confrontation now stopped entirely as the significance of what they were witnessing became clear.
Pause, rediscover any foreseason to see clear and submerge from either side.
This wasn't just an NCO correcting a soldier anymore. This was a teaching moment that would be talked about for months. Private Johnson, who had been watching the entire interaction from behind the serving counter, finally allowed himself a small smile. He had known exactly how this would end from the moment Coleman approached Captain Martinez, but military protocol had prevented him from intervening.
Now he watched as one of the most important lessons in military leadership played out in real time. Captain Martinez had earned her rank through a combination of military education, practical experience, and proven leadership under pressure that few people in the cafeteria could match.
Her path to becoming a captain had included officer candidate school, where she had graduated near the top of her class. It had included multiple deployments where she had led soldiers through complex and dangerous missions. It had included advanced training in tactics, logistics, and human resources management that qualified her to make decisions affecting hundreds of people. More importantly, her leadership style had been forged in real combat situations where the wrong decision could mean the difference between soldiers coming home safely or not coming home at all. She had learned to balance authority with compassion, to correct mistakes without destroying confidence, and to teach lessons that would stick without creating enemies in the process. All of this experience now came to bear on how she chose to handle Staff Sergeant Coleman's moment of mortification. "Sergeant Coleman," she said, her voice still calm but now carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority, "I think we need to discuss what just happened here." Coleman finally managed to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident bark. "Ma'am, Captain, I sincerely apologize. I didn't realize, I should have looked more carefully."
I just assumed, yes, Captain Martinez interrupted gently. You assumed.
And that's exactly what we need to talk about. She gestured toward an empty table in a corner of the cafeteria, away from the main flow of traffic but still visible to anyone who wanted to observe. This wasn't going to be a private conversation. The lesson being taught here was too important for secrecy. But she was choosing a location where they could speak without blocking the normal operations of the dining facility.
As they moved toward the table, Coleman's mind raced through the implications of his mistake.
Captain Martinez outranked him by enough that she could, if she chose, make his life very difficult. She could file a complaint with his chain of command. She could demand disciplinary action. She could make the next several months of his military career extremely unpleasant. But as they sat down across from each other, her expression suggested that punishment wasn't her primary concern. This was going to be a different kind of conversation than he had expected.
"Sergeant Coleman," she began, "tell me what you thought you saw when you first noticed me in line." The question caught him off guard. He had expected anger, demands for apology, maybe threats of disciplinary action.
Instead, she was asking him to analyze his own thought process. Well, ma'am, I saw a soldier whose uniform appeared to be below standards, and I felt it was my responsibility as an NCO to provide correction." His voice was quiet now, the swagger completely gone.
"And what made you conclude that my uniform was below standards?" Coleman shifted uncomfortably. The honest answer was that he had seen what he expected to see, rather than what was actually there.
It appeared dusty and wrinkled, Captain. And from that observation, what else did you conclude about me? This line of questioning was making Coleman examine assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making.
"I concluded that you were probably a junior enlisted soldier who had been careless about maintaining proper appearance." Based on what evidence? The question hung in the air. Coleman realized that his assumptions had been based on virtually no evidence at all.
He had seen a relatively young-looking woman with a slightly dusty uniform and had immediately categorized her as someone junior and probably problematic. He had never looked at her rank.
They had never considered that there might be legitimate reasons for her appearance. He had never even entertained the possibility that she might be someone with more experience and authority than he possessed.
But you...
Based on no real evidence, ma'am.
I made assumptions. Captain Martinez nodded. Now we're getting somewhere.
Tell me, in your 12 years of service, have you ever finished a field training exercise looking perfectly pressed and dust-free?
No, ma'am. Have you ever encountered situations where the demands of the mission took priority over the appearance of the uniform?
Yes, ma'am. Then why do you think those same realities wouldn't apply to other soldiers? Coleman was beginning to understand that this conversation was about much more than his mistake in identifying her rank. This was about the assumptions that had led to the mistake, and those assumptions revealed problems in his thinking that went far beyond simply failing to read someone's insignia properly.
I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully, I think I jumped to conclusions without gathering adequate information. That's part of it, Captain Martinez agreed. But let's dig deeper.
What specifically made you assume that a soldier with a dusty uniform was necessarily being careless rather than hardworking? The question forced Coleman to confront an uncomfortable truth. In his mind, he had somehow connected dusty uniform with laziness rather than with honest work. He had seen the evidence of field training and interpreted it as a lack of standards rather than as proof of effort. "I think I was looking for problems instead of looking for the whole picture," he admitted. Several soldiers at nearby tables were clearly listening to the conversation, though they were pretending to focus on their meals. This kind of real-time leadership training was rare and valuable, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that would influence how they thought about leadership, assumptions, and respect for years to come. Captain Martinez leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant Coleman, in your role as an NCO, you have the responsibility to maintain standards and provide guidance to junior soldiers. That's an important job, and the Army depends on NCOs like you to fulfill that role effectively. But how do you think this conversation might have gone differently if you had approached it with curiosity rather than assumption?"
Coleman thought about this.
I could have found out what kind of training you had been doing. I could have looked at your rank before saying anything.
Exactly. And what might that have told you? It might have told me that you were conducting legitimate training and that your uniform reflected professional military work rather than carelessness. And how do you think the soldiers watching our original interaction felt when they saw you making assumptions about someone's competence and dedication based on incomplete information? This question hit Coleman harder than any punishment could have.
He realized that his public display of poor judgment hadn't just been a mistake, it had been a demonstration of exactly the kind of leadership that undermines trust and respect in military units.
They probably lost some confidence in my judgment as an NCO,
he said quietly.
Leadership credibility is easy to lose and difficult to rebuild, Captain Martinez observed. But the good news is that how you handle mistakes can actually strengthen that credibility if you approach it correctly. For the first time since the conversation began, Coleman felt a glimmer of hope that this encounter might end with something other than complete professional humiliation.
Captain Martinez watched as Sergeant Coleman processed the weight of his mistake, but she also observed something else in his expression: genuine remorse and a willingness to learn. This was the difference between a teachable moment and a lost cause.
Coleman's ego had taken a hit, but his character was still intact. Sergeant Coleman, she continued, I want to share something with you that might help put this conversation in perspective.
3 years ago, I made a similar assumption about someone, though the circumstances were different. Coleman looked up, surprised.
He hadn't expected her to share a personal experience of making mistakes. I was deployed in Afghanistan, and we had a new interpreter assigned to our unit.
Young guy, maybe 25, spoke excellent English but dressed in simple local clothes. For the first week, I treated him like he was just another local hire who needed constant supervision and basic instruction.
She paused, allowing the parallel to sink in. Then I learned that he had a master's degree in international relations from Kabul University, spoke 6 languages fluently, and had been working with American forces for 4 years.
He had risked his life countless times to provide intelligence that saved American soldiers. My assumptions about his capabilities based on his appearance and age had prevented me from utilizing one of the most valuable resources our unit had.
I did that 2 weeks after.
Coleman nodded slowly. How did you handle it when you realized your mistake?
I did what you're going to do.
I acknowledged the error. I learned from it. And I made sure that my future leadership was based on evidence rather than assumptions. And most importantly, I used the experience to become better at developing and recognizing the potential in others. This was the heart of what Captain Martinez wanted to communicate. Mistakes were inevitable in leadership. The measure of a good leader wasn't the absence of errors, but how those errors were handled and what growth came from them.
Now, she said, let's talk about what happens next.
You made this mistake in front of a lot of people, which means your response to it will also be public. That gives you an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership the Army needs.
Coleman straightened slightly. What do you recommend, Captain?
First, you need to understand that accountability isn't the same thing as humiliation.
Taking responsibility for your error shows strength, not weakness. Second, you need to think about what this experience teaches you about evaluating people and situations. And third, you need to consider how you can use this lesson to become a better NCO.
She gestured toward the cafeteria around them, where conversations had resumed, but many people were still glancing in their direction. Every person in this room learned something today. They learned that assumptions can be dangerous. They learned that respect should be based on merit rather than appearance. And they're about to learn how a professional handles being wrong. Coleman took a deep breath. Captain, I owe you a public apology.
I was wrong to approach you with assumptions instead of facts. I was wrong to speak to you disrespectfully. And I was wrong to let my own preconceptions override my professional judgment.
That's a good start, Captain Martinez acknowledged. But I want you to think about something else. This wasn't just about disrespecting me.
What impact do you think your assumptions might have on other soldiers who don't happen to outrank you? This question opened up a much larger issue that Coleman hadn't fully considered. His approach to that interaction revealed thought patterns that could affect how he treated junior soldiers, especially those who might not fit his preconceived notions of what a good soldier looked like.
You're right, Captain. If I'm making assumptions about officers, I'm probably making the same kinds of assumptions about the soldiers I'm supposed to be developing.
Exactly.
And that's the real leadership lesson here.
Every soldier deserves to be evaluated based on their performance, their character, and their potential, not on whether they fit someone else's idea of what they should look like or how they should present themselves.
Captain Martinez had led enough soldiers to know that some of the best performers often came from unexpected backgrounds or didn't fit traditional military stereotypes. She had seen quiet, unassuming soldiers perform acts of incredible courage under fire.
She had watched people who seemed unremarkable in garrison prove themselves to be natural leaders when tested by real challenges.
Sergeant Coleman, can I ask you something about your leadership philosophy? Of course, Captain. When you see a soldier who looks different from what you expect, or who comes from a background you're not familiar with, what's your first instinct? Coleman considered this carefully.
The honest answer was that his first instinct was often to be skeptical, to assume that different meant problematic. But today's experience was making him question whether that instinct was helping or hurting his effectiveness as a leader. My first instinct is usually to be cautious, maybe a little skeptical. I guess I've always thought that was just being realistic about military standards.
And how has that approach affected the soldiers you've worked with? Coleman thought about some of the junior soldiers he had supervised over the years.
There had been a few who had seemed promising but had eventually transferred to other units or left the Army entirely.
At the time, he had assumed they weren't cut out for military life, but now he wondered if his skepticism and assumptions had contributed to their decisions to leave.
I think it might have caused some good soldiers to feel like they had to prove themselves constantly instead of feeling like they were valued members of the team. That's a profound insight, Captain Martinez said, and it points to one of the most important responsibilities we have as leaders, creating environments where people can succeed rather than environments where they have to overcome our prejudices in addition to meeting mission requirements.
Around them, the cafeteria was beginning to empty as soldiers finished their meals and headed to evening duties. But the conversation at their corner table continued to draw occasional attention from those who recognized the significance of what they were witnessing.
How loud that C-bow died off at the transfer.
Captain, how do you recommend I handle this going forward? I mean, beyond apologizing to you.
Well, first you should know that this conversation is your apology to me.
What happened earlier was a mistake born of poor judgment, not malicious intent. We've addressed it professionally, and as far as I'm concerned, the matter is resolved between us.
Coleman felt a wave of relief, but Captain Martinez wasn't finished. However, you now have a responsibility to your own soldiers and to the NCO Corps to make sure this experience translates into better leadership.
That means examining your own biases, questioning your assumptions, and approaching your duties with more humility and curiosity. What would that look like in practical terms? Start by looking at how you evaluate the soldiers under your supervision. Are you giving everyone equal opportunities to prove themselves? Or are you unconsciously playing favorites based on who fits your idea of what a soldier should be? Are you taking the time to understand each person's strengths and challenges, or are you making quick judgments based on surface appearances? Coleman realized that this would require some serious self-reflection. He had always prided himself on being fair, but fairness required more than just following regulations. It required actively working against his own unconscious biases. I think I need to have some individual conversations with my soldiers and ask them about their experiences and their goals. I need to find out if I've been missing opportunities to help them develop. That's exactly right. And Sergeant Coleman, when you have those conversations, remember that leadership isn't about demonstrating your authority. It's about helping others reach their potential. This is the definite argument for yourself.
The best NCOs I've worked with are the ones who measure their success by how well their soldiers perform in advance, not by how much respect they can command through intimidation.
Captain Martinez checked her watch.
Her night shift was supposed to begin soon, and she still needed to grab something to eat. But this conversation was too important to cut short, without making sure the lessons were clearly understood.
There's one more thing I want you to consider, she said. Today you learned something valuable about the dangers of making assumptions.
But you also demonstrated something positive about your character. When you realized your mistake, you didn't try to justify it or deflect responsibility. You acknowledged it and showed a willingness to learn. That's the foundation of good leadership right there.
Coleman felt something shift in his understanding of what this encounter meant. Instead of being a career-ending humiliation, it was becoming a turning point in his development as a leader. Captain, I want you to know that this conversation has given me a lot to think about. I'm grateful that you chose to handle this as a learning experience rather than just a disciplinary issue.
Sergeant Coleman, the Army invests a lot of time and resources in developing NCOs because you're the backbone of military leadership. My job as an officer is to help you succeed in that role, not to destroy your confidence when you make mistakes.
What matters now is how you apply what you've learned. As their conversation drew to a close, both of them were aware that dozens of soldiers had witnessed not just the original confrontation, but the professional way it had been resolved.
The ripple effects of this interaction would influence conversations about leadership, respect, and professional development throughout the base for months to come. Word of the cafeteria incident spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire.
By the next morning, soldiers throughout the base were discussing what had happened, but the conversations weren't taking the direction that Staff Sergeant Coleman had feared.
Instead of becoming a cautionary tale about career-ending mistakes, the story was evolving into something more complex and ultimately more valuable.
Private First Class Maria Santos heard about it from her bunkmate during morning formation. "Did you hear about Sergeant Coleman and Captain Martinez in the dining facility yesterday?" her friend whispered as they waited for their squad leader to begin the day's briefing.
No, what happened? Coleman went off on this woman he thought was a junior enlisted soldier who wasn't maintaining uniform standards. Turned out she was a captain who had been doing field training all day. Santos winced in sympathy. That must have been embarrassing. That's the crazy part. Apparently, Captain Martinez handled it like a total professional.
Instead of destroying him, she turned it into a learning experience. People are saying it was like watching a master class in leadership.
Similar conversations were happening throughout the base. In the motor pool, mechanics discussed how the incident highlighted the importance of getting complete information before making decisions.
In the barracks, junior enlisted soldiers talked about the difference between leadership that punishes and leadership that develops. And in the NCO offices, senior staff members found themselves examining their own practices and assumptions.
Sergeant First Class Williams, who had been Coleman's mentor when he first arrived at Fort Bragg, sought him out later that morning.
Coleman, I heard about yesterday.
How are you handling it? Coleman looked up from the maintenance reports he was reviewing. He had been dreading conversations like this one, expecting ridicule or lectures about professional embarrassment. But Williams's tone was more concerned than judgmental. Honestly, Sergeant First Class, it was one of the most educational experiences I've had in my 12 years of service. Captain Martinez could have destroyed my career, but instead she helped me understand some serious flaws in my leadership approach. Williams raised an eyebrow.
How so? I've realized that I've been making assumptions about soldiers based on their appearance or background instead of evaluating them based on their performance and potential. And I've been approaching leadership as if my job was to find problems and correct them instead of finding strengths and developing them.
This was not the response Williams had expected. He had come prepared to offer damage control advice and moral support for a career setback. Instead, he was hearing about genuine professional growth.
That's actually pretty impressive self-awareness. How are you planning to apply that going forward?
I'm scheduling individual meetings with all the soldiers in my section.
I want to understand their goals, their challenges, and their perspectives on how I can better support their development. And I'm going to be much more careful about checking my assumptions before I act on them. Williams nodded approvingly. That sounds like the right approach.
And Coleman?
Don't let this eat at you too much. Every good NCO has a story about a time when they learned a hard lesson about leadership. The difference between good leaders and poor ones is what they do with those lessons.
Meanwhile, Captain Martinez was dealing with her own aftermath from the incident.
Her phone had been buzzing all morning with messages from fellow officers who had heard various versions of the story. Major Thompson, her battalion commander, called her into his office mid-morning.
Sarah, I keep hearing about something that happened in the dining facility yesterday. Care to fill me in on the details? Captain Martinez provided a straightforward account of the interaction, including both Coleman's initial mistake and how they had resolved it.
And you handled it as an informal counseling session rather than filing a complaint? Yes, sir. Sergeant Coleman demonstrated genuine remorse and a willingness to learn.
Destroying his career wouldn't have served any useful purpose, but helping him become a better leader benefits everyone.
Major Thompson leaned back in his chair.
You know, Sarah, that kind of restraint and professional development focus is exactly what we need more of in the officer corps. Too many people see corrections as opportunities for punishment rather than opportunities for growth.
Thank you, sir. I learned that approach from some excellent leaders during my deployments. Mistakes are inevitable. What matters is how we respond to them. Have you considered that this incident might be worth discussing with our leadership development program? It sounds like both you and Coleman demonstrated exactly the kind of professional growth mindset we're trying to cultivate. Captain Martinez hadn't considered that angle, but Major Thompson was right. The way the situation had been handled could serve as a case study for other leaders facing similar challenges. Back in the dining facility, Private Johnson found himself fielding questions from curious soldiers who wanted to hear a first-hand account of what had happened. As someone who had witnessed the entire interaction, he was uniquely positioned to provide accurate details. The thing that impressed me most, he told a group of soldiers during lunch, was how Captain Martinez never tried to humiliate Sergeant Coleman. She could have pulled rank immediately and made him look like a fool, but instead she guided him through understanding his mistakes step by step. What did Coleman do when he realized she was an officer? Asked Specialist Rodriguez. He owned up to his error immediately. No excuses. no trying to justify it. And then he listened while she helped him understand how to avoid similar mistakes in the future.
It was actually pretty professional on both sides. These conversations were having an unexpected effect throughout the base.
Soldiers were discussing leadership styles, the importance of checking assumptions, and the difference between corrective action and professional development. The incident was becoming a catalyst for broader conversations about respect, professionalism, and effective leadership.
Sergeant Coleman found that his initial fears about career damage were proving unfounded.
Instead of losing respect from his peers, he was finding that his honest handling of the mistake was actually enhancing his reputation.
Other NCOs were approaching him to discuss their own experiences with making assumptions or misreading situations.
"You know what I respect about how you handled it?" Staff Sergeant Mitchell told him during a break in training.
"You didn't try to save face or make excuses.
You admitted the mistake and focused on learning from it. That takes character."
Coleman was discovering that vulnerability and accountability, when handled professionally, could actually strengthen leadership credibility rather than undermine it. This was a lesson that went far beyond the specific incident with Captain Martinez. 3 days after the cafeteria encounter, Coleman received an unexpected email from Captain Martinez. She was organizing a leadership development workshop for NCOs and junior officers, and she wanted to know if he would be willing to participate as a co-presenter, sharing his perspective on learning from leadership mistakes.
The request surprised him, but it also represented something significant. Instead of being defined by his error, he was being invited to help others learn from it. The mistake was becoming a foundation for growth rather than a source of shame. As he drafted his response accepting the invitation, Coleman reflected on how dramatically his understanding of leadership had evolved in just 3 days. He had always thought that good leaders were those who never made mistakes. Now he understood that good leaders were those who made mistakes, learned from them, and used those lessons to help others grow. The incident was also having ripple effects in Captain Martinez's own leadership development. She found herself paying more attention to her own assumptions and biases, particularly in situations where she might unconsciously apply different standards to different people. During a staff meeting later that week, she shared some thoughts with her fellow officers about the importance of creating environments where mistakes could become learning opportunities rather than career-ending disasters. "We talk a lot about developing our soldiers," she said, "but sometimes we forget that development requires the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them. If we create cultures where any error results in severe punishment, we discourage the kind of risk-taking and initiative that we actually want to see." Her comments sparked a discussion about how to balance accountability with development, how to maintain standards while allowing room for growth, and how to distinguish between mistakes that indicate poor character and mistakes that indicate inexperience or poor judgment. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, the brigade operations officer, made a note to incorporate some of these concepts into the unit's professional development curriculum.
"It sounds like you two have stumbled onto something that could benefit leader development throughout the brigade," he observed. By the end of the week, what had started as an embarrassing mistake in a dining facility had evolved into a case study that was influencing leadership training throughout Fort Bragg. The story was being shared not as an example of what not to do, but as an example of how to handle mistakes professionally when they inevitably occur.
Sergeant Coleman's soldiers had noticed changes in his leadership approach.
Instead of looking for problems to correct, he was asking more questions about their goals and challenges. Instead of making quick judgments, he was taking time to understand situations more completely.
"Sergeant Coleman seems different lately," Private Washington mentioned to his squad mates. "More approachable, I guess. Like he's actually interested in helping us succeed instead of just catching us doing things wrong." These changes weren't dramatic or obvious, but they represented exactly the kind of evolution that Captain Martinez had hoped to encourage.
Good leadership development was often measured in small improvements in daily interactions rather than dramatic transformations. 6 months after the cafeteria incident, Fort Bragg was hosting its quarterly Leadership Symposium, an event that brought together officers and NCOs from across the installation to discuss best practices, share experiences, and address common challenges.
This particular symposium had drawn special attention because word had spread about a unique presentation on learning from leadership mistakes. Captain Martinez and Staff Sergeant Coleman stood together in the wings of the base theater reviewing their notes one final time. The auditorium was packed with over 300 soldiers, from fresh lieutenants to seasoned command sergeants major.
What had started as a single embarrassing moment had evolved into a comprehensive case study that was now influencing leadership development across multiple units.
"Are you nervous?" Captain Martinez asked Coleman as they waited for their introduction.
Coleman smiled, a far cry from the defensive swagger he had displayed 6 months earlier. "A little, but in a good way."
I never thought I'd be grateful for making such a public mistake, but it turned out to be exactly what I needed to become a better leader. Their presentation was titled The Assumption Trap: How Preconceptions Limit Leadership Effectiveness, and it had been developed through months of reflection, research, and consultation with leadership development experts.
What had begun as a personal learning experience had expanded into a broader examination of how unconscious biases affect military leadership at every level. Major Thompson introduced them to the audience, providing context for their unique collaboration.
6 months ago, these two soldiers had an interaction that could have ended in disciplinary action and damaged careers. Instead, they chose to turn it into a learning opportunity that has already influenced leadership development throughout our brigade.
Today, they're going to share what they've learned about assumptions, accountability, and professional growth. Captain Martinez took the stage first, establishing the framework for their discussion. Every leader in this room has made assumptions about people that turned out to be wrong. Every leader has had moments when their preconceptions prevented them from seeing the full picture. The question isn't whether we make these mistakes, it's how we respond when we realize we've made them. She outlined the psychological research behind unconscious bias, explaining how the human brain uses shortcuts to process information quickly, but how those same shortcuts can lead to errors in judgment when applied to complex human interactions.
Military leadership requires making rapid decisions with limited information, she continued. That's a valuable skill in tactical situations, but it can become a liability when we're evaluating people or building teams.
The challenge is learning when to trust our quick judgments and when to slow down and gather more information.
When Sergeant Coleman joined her on stage, the audience paid close attention.
His perspective as the person who had made the initial mistake added authenticity to the presentation that pure theory could never achieve. 6 months ago, I thought good leadership meant having all the answers and maintaining absolute authority. Coleman began, I believe that showing uncertainty or admitting mistakes would undermine my credibility with my soldiers. I was wrong on both counts. He described the thought process that had led to his confrontation with Captain Martinez, walking the audience through the assumptions he had made and the flawed reasoning behind them. But rather than dwelling on the mistake itself, he focused on the learning process that had followed.
The most important thing I learned wasn't just to read rank insignia more carefully, he said, drawing chuckles from the audience. What I learned was that my job as an NCO isn't to catch soldiers doing things wrong, it's to help them do things right, and that requires understanding each person as an individual rather than making judgments based on stereotypes. The presentation included practical exercises designed to help leaders identify their own unconscious biases. Participants worked through scenarios where they had to evaluate soldiers based on limited information, then discuss how additional context changed their assessments. During one exercise, they presented the audience with written profiles of several soldiers, their test scores, performance evaluations, and brief behavioral descriptions, without providing names, photos, or demographic information. Participants were asked to rank the soldiers in terms of leadership potential and explain their reasoning. Now, Captain Martinez said after the rankings were complete, let's add some additional information about these same soldiers. The additional details revealed that some of the highest-ranked profiles belonged to soldiers whose backgrounds challenged common assumptions about military success. One belonged to a former gang member who had joined the Army to change his life trajectory. Another belonged to a soldier who had initially struggled with physical fitness standards but had developed exceptional technical skills. A third belonged to someone who had been written off by previous supervisors as having attitude problems but had thrived under different leadership. How many of you would have ranked these soldiers differently if you had known these background details from the beginning? Coleman asked. Nearly every hand in the auditorium went up.
That's exactly the point,
he continued. We all carry mental models of what success looks like, and those models can blind us to potential that doesn't fit our expectations. The most powerful segment of their presentation focused on accountability and recovery from leadership mistakes. Captain Martinez shared research showing that leaders who acknowledge errors and demonstrate learning from them actually increase rather than decrease their credibility with subordinates.
Military culture often sends the message that leaders must be infallible, she explained.
But soldiers don't actually expect their leaders to be perfect. What they expect is honesty, growth, and the ability to admit when you've been wrong. The leaders who lose credibility are the ones who try to cover up mistakes or blame others, not the ones who own their errors and learn from them. Coleman described the changes he had implemented in his leadership approach following the cafeteria incident. He had begun conducting regular one-on-one meetings with his soldiers, not to address problems but to understand their goals and challenges. He had started asking for feedback on his own performance, creating opportunities for subordinates to share perspectives on his leadership effectiveness. The results have been remarkable, he told the audience.
My soldiers are more engaged, more willing to take initiative, and more likely to come to me with problems before they become serious issues. The 9/11 hits are the body of the same intensity function, and ironically, our unit's performance metrics have improved across the board. During the question and answer session that followed, the audience engagement was intense. Officers and NCOs shared their own experiences with leadership mistakes, asked for advice on handling difficult personnel situations, and discussed strategies for creating cultures that encouraged growth rather than punishment. One particularly poignant question came from a young lieutenant who was struggling with a soldier she perceived as having a poor attitude. How do you distinguish between someone who genuinely has performance problems and someone who just doesn't fit your expectations? Captain Martinez and Sergeant Coleman exchanged a look before answering. This was exactly the kind of situation where their experience could provide practical guidance.
Start with curiosity instead of judgment, Captain Martinez advised. Ask yourself what might be driving the behavior you're seeing.
Is it a lack of skill that can be addressed through training? Is it a personal issue that's affecting performance temporarily? Or is it a fundamental mismatch between the soldier's capabilities and the role they've been assigned? Coleman added, and remember that attitude problems are often symptoms of other issues. I've learned that when soldiers seem disengaged or resistant, it's usually because they don't feel valued, understood, or properly utilized. Addressing those underlying issues is often more effective than simply demanding behavior change. Following the presentation, both Captain Martinez and Sergeant Coleman found themselves surrounded by colleagues who wanted to continue the conversation. Junior officers sought advice on handling their own leadership challenges. This was exactly the kind of professional development our Army needs more of, he said. You've taken a potentially negative experience and turned it into something that will benefit leaders throughout our installation and beyond. He informed them that he was recommending their presentation be included in the Army's professional military education curriculum, potentially reaching thousands of leaders across the service. But perhaps the most meaningful feedback came from the soldiers who had witnessed or heard about the original incident. Private Johnson, who had served Captain Martinez her meal that day in the cafeteria, approached Coleman after the presentation.
Sergeant Coleman, I just wanted you to know that watching how you and Captain Martinez handled that situation changed how I think about leadership. When I become an NCO someday, I want to handle mistakes the way you two did, with honesty and a focus on learning.
This comment encapsulated the broader impact of their experience. What had started as an embarrassing mistake had become a model for professional development that was influencing an entire generation of military leaders.
In the months that followed, Captain Martinez and Sergeant Coleman continued to collaborate on leadership development initiatives. They co-authored articles for military professional journals, participated in leadership symposiums at other installations, and served as mentors for officers and NCOs facing their own leadership challenges.
Their partnership became a symbol of how differences in rank, background, and perspective could be leveraged to create stronger, more effective leadership teams. Instead of allowing hierarchy to prevent honest communication and mutual learning, they had demonstrated how professional relationships could transcend traditional boundaries when built on mutual respect and shared commitment to growth.
The cafeteria incident had lasted only a few minutes, but its lessons continued to influence military leadership development years later. It served as a reminder that the most powerful learning opportunities often emerge from the most uncomfortable moments, and that true professional growth requires the courage to examine our own assumptions, admit our mistakes, and commit to doing better.
Most importantly, it demonstrated that respect in military organizations shouldn't be based on rank alone, but on character, competence, and the willingness to serve something greater than oneself. Whether you're a sergeant or a captain, a private or a general, the principles of honest leadership, continuous learning, and mutual respect remain the foundation of military excellence.
The story that began with a mocking question, "And what's your rank?" had evolved into a comprehensive lesson about the true meaning of military leadership. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from our successes, but from our willingness to learn from our failures and help others do the same.